The lantern was still warm. Belle Maddox stood on the porch of Gilbert Graves's farmhouse with the thing clutched against her chest like it was made of something precious, like it was something she did not want to let go of, which was a thought she pushed away the moment it surfaced because she had come here with one purpose and one purpose only. She had borrowed the lantern 3 weeks ago when her own had shattered on the road back from Harlan Creek, and she had carried Gilbert's borrowed light all the way home through the dark, and now she was returning it. That was all. That was the entirety of the transaction. A simple, neighborly exchange on a Tuesday evening in the autumn of 1882, in a small corner of the New Mexico territory where simple, neighborly exchanges were the only kind Belle Maddox allowed herself anymore. She knocked. The door swung open before the second knock, and there was Rosie Graves, 7 years old and barefoot on the cold wood planks, her dark hair wild around her shoulders and her father's serious eyes looking up at Belle with an intensity that made Belle's breath catch. "Miss Maddox," Rosie said like she'd been expecting her. "Hello, Rosie, is your father home? I have come to return this to him." Rosie looked at the lantern. She looked at Belle. Something shifted in her small, grave face, and she stepped aside and opened the door wider in that precise, deliberate way she had, the way that so resembled her father that Belle felt the resemblance like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. "Papa's in the barn," Rosie said. "But Miss Maddox, would you stay? Just until this lantern burns all the way down." Belle opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the lantern, still faintly warm in her hands, oil still sloshing gently inside the glass chamber, enough left to burn for 2, maybe 3 hours. She knew she should say no. Knew it the way she knew every truth she'd been running from for the past year and a half since she'd come to Harlan County from Santa Fe, with a dead man's name still on her tongue, and a buried secret that the whole county would have used against her if they'd known. She knew she should hand the lantern off to Rosie, tip her chin up, and walk back down the road to her rented room above the dry goods store before something complicated happened. But Rosie Graves was looking at her with those bottomless eyes, and the evening was going the deep, bruised purple that October evenings went in the high desert, and Belle had been alone, genuinely alone, for longer than she could stand to measure. "All right," Belle said, and she stepped inside. The trouble was that she had not been honest with herself about Gilbert Graves, not once, not from the very first day she'd seen him at the Harlan Creek General Store, pulling a feed order that was too heavy for one man's arms and refusing help with a quiet, stubborn dignity that had made her chest ache with a recognition she had no business feeling. She had told herself he was a neighbor. She had told herself his lantern was simply the nearest one when her own broke. She had told herself, each of the 6 or 7 times their paths had crossed in the months since, that the warmth she felt when he looked at her was simply the warmth of human kindness in a territory that offered it sparingly. She had not been honest with herself, and now she was standing in his kitchen, and his youngest daughter had just asked her to stay, and the whole situation felt like it was about to reveal something that could not be put back the way it was before. Harlan County, New Mexico Territory, 1882. The year the railroad was pushing through the mountains to the west, and bringing with it the particular kind of chaos that followed money and speed, the kind that rattled old arrangements and forced people to make choices they had been avoiding. The county seat was a town called Tulliver, with a main street wide enough to turn a wagon around on, and a sheriff named Cade Hutton who was good at his job in the way that most useful things in the territory were good at their jobs, which was to say adequately and without elegance. Belle had arrived in Tulliver in the spring of 1881 on a stage from Santa Fe with a carpetbag and a story about being a widowed schoolteacher looking for work, and the story was mostly true. Mostly. The part that was not true was the part about the widow. Her name was Belle Maddox. That part was real. She had been born Belle Hargrove in a small town in Kansas in 1856, which made her 26 years old in the autumn of 1882. She had married a man named Thomas Maddox in 1879 when she was 23, And Thomas Maddox had been dead for a year before she arrived in Tulliver, so technically the widow part was true as well. What was not true was the clean, uncomplicated grief she implied when she let people assume she had simply lost a husband to illness or an accident. Thomas Maddox had not died of illness. He had died badly, at the end of a situation that Belle had partly caused and partly survived, and the survival itself was the secret she carried like an extra bone inside her chest, heavy and impossible to ignore. She was not ready to tell that story to anyone. Certainly not to Gilbert Graves, who was a man built so entirely out of quiet steadiness that his proximity made her feel the ragged edges of her own secrets more sharply. She had learned his story piecemeal, the way you learned anyone's story in a county like Harlan, through overheard conversations at the dry goods store and careful questions that looked like casual interest. Gilbert Graves was 31 years old. He had come to Harlan County 7 years ago from Texas with his wife, Martha, and a small stake, and a determination to build something real. He had built it. The farm was a working farm, not rich, but honest, with cattle and a kitchen garden and 2 daughters he raised with a tenderness that the county noticed and respected. Martha Graves had died of typhoid in 1880, 18 months before Belle arrived, and Gilbert had raised those 2 girls alone ever since. The older daughter was Ida, who was 11 and had her mother's fair coloring and her father's quiet resolve. The younger was Rosie, who was 7 and had her father's dark eyes and nobody's patience for pretense. Belle had first spoken to Rosie 3 weeks ago, the night her lantern broke on the road home from visiting the schoolhouse where she taught. She had knocked on the farmhouse door in the dark, embarrassed and cold, and it had been Gilbert who answered, Gilbert with his sleeves rolled and his expression calm, who had listened to her explanation and gone to get his spare lantern without making her feel foolish for needing it. He had said, "Keep it as long as you need, Miss Maddox," and the way he'd said her name, careful and respectful, had settled somewhere in her she could not name. And she had thought about that tone of voice more often in the 3 weeks since than she was comfortable admitting. Now she was inside his kitchen, and Rosie was pulling out a chair at the table with the purposeful hospitality of someone twice her age, and there was a pot of beans on the stove that smelled like cumin and wood smoke and home, and Belle sat down because she did not know how to leave. "Papa will be in soon," Rosie said, settling into her own chair across from Belle with her chin propped in her hands. "He was fixing the fence on the north pasture. He came in for supper, and then he went back out because he said the section on the corner was still wrong. Does he often go back out after supper?" "Something's wrong, he fixes it," Rosie said, with the simple certainty of a child who had never had reason to doubt that about her father. "He doesn't leave things wrong if he can help it." Belle looked at the lantern which she had set in the middle of the table, its flame small and steady in the evening quiet. "Your father lent me this," she said. "I know," Rosie said. "He said you had it. He said you would bring it back when you were ready." She paused. "He talked about you sometimes." Belle looked up. "Did he?" "He said you were good with words." Rosie tilted her head. "He heard you at the school board meeting when Mr. Calloway said the school didn't need another teacher and you argued back. He said you didn't shout. He said you just kept saying true things until Mr. Calloway ran out of untrue ones." Belle felt something loosen in her throat, a tightness she had not realized was there. "That is a very kind way to describe what happened." "Papa usually finds kind ways," Rosie said, and then she looked at the lantern again. "Will you stay until it burns all the way down?" Belle did not say yes again. She just stayed, which was the same thing. She heard Gilbert before she saw him, boots on the porch steps, and then the particular way he scraped them on the boot scraper, deliberate and thorough, the sound of a man who cared about the cleanliness of his own house even when no one was watching. The door opened and he came in with cold air at his back and mud on his knees from where he had knelt by the fence, and he saw her at his kitchen table and he stopped. Not with alarm, something else. "Miss Maddox," he said. "Mr. Graves." She stood. "I came to return your lantern. Rosie asked me to stay. I should not have, but I'm glad you did," he said. The words came out simply, without calculation, and he seemed to be as surprised by them as she was because something flickered in his expression, a brief private reckoning, before he pulled his composure back around him and hung his hat on the hook beside the door. "Ida is upstairs," he asked Rosie. "Reading," Rosie confirmed. "Would you get her?" he said. "Tell her we have company for the evening." Rosie scrambled off her chair and up the stairs with the quick, silent efficiency of a child who could move like water when she wanted to, and then Belle and Gilbert were alone in the kitchen, and the lantern burned between them, and the whole room felt like something that could tip either direction. "You did not have to stay," he said. He was washing his hands at the basin, his back to her, which made it easier to be honest. "I know," she said, "but Rosie asked." "She did." A pause. He dried his hands and turned around. He was not a dramatically handsome man, not the kind the dime novels described, all jaw and devil-may-care fire in the eyes. He was handsome the way enduring things were handsome, the way a well-made saddle was handsome, the way a farmhouse with sound walls and a good roof was handsome. He had the kind of face that would look essentially the same at 40 as it did at 31, because it had been built by character rather than youth, and character did not fade the way youth did. He looked at her steadily. "She does not usually ask people to stay," he said. "Rosie, I mean. She is particular about people." "She must have inherited that," Belle said, and immediately wondered if she had overstepped. But Gilbert Graves smiled. It was a restrained smile, the kind that acknowledged the accuracy of an observation rather than performing amusement at it, and it changed his face in a way that did something entirely unwelcome to Belle's composure. "She must have," he agreed. They heard Ida on the stairs, and the moment shifted, and Gilbert moved to the stove to add wood, and Belle settled back into her chair, and the lantern burned. Over the course of the next 2 hours, something happened that Belle would later describe to herself as dangerous, and would describe to no one else as anything at all, because there were no words in her vocabulary for the specific experience of sitting at a man's kitchen table while his daughters argued about the proper way to braid a horse's mane, and feeling for the first time in 2 years that the place you were sitting was precisely the place you were supposed to be. Ida was a revelation. At 11, she had the combination of fierce intelligence and painful self-awareness that made bright girls at that age simultaneously exhausting and extraordinary. She had decided within 5 minutes of meeting Belle that Belle was worth talking to, and she had spent the subsequent hour asking questions about books and schooling, and whether Belle thought women in the territory would ever be permitted to vote, a question that Gilbert had answered before Belle could with a quiet, "They ought to be." That made Ida grin and Belle go very still for a moment. Gilbert himself said less than his daughters, which was not unusual for him, but he listened in the particular way he had, with his full attention, and occasionally he added something that was brief and exact and illuminated the conversation like a struck match. He refilled her coffee without asking. He caught Rosie yawning and sent her to bed with a gentleness that was so natural it was invisible, the way good parenting was invisible, the way love was invisible when it had been practiced long enough to become structural. Belle watched all of it and hated herself a little for watching so closely. She left at 9 o'clock, when the lantern had burned down to a stub and the flame was beginning to gutter. She stood and said she had imposed long enough, and Gilbert said she had not imposed at all, and Rosie, who had been allowed to come back down for a glass of water and had then installed herself on the settle with a blanket and stayed there, said, "You should come back, Miss Maddox." "That is up to Miss Maddox," Gilbert said, and Belle said, "Good night," and walked back down the road to Tulliver in the dark with no lantern at all, because she had returned the borrowed one and she had no light of her own, and she did not mind. She was in trouble. She knew that. The trouble had a name and a face and a very particular way of turning toward a person when they spoke that suggested their words were the most important words in the room. The trouble was named Gilbert Graves, and the trouble lived on a farm 3 miles outside Tulliver, and the trouble had a dead wife and 2 living daughters, and a kind of quiet goodness that made Belle feel like a forgery standing next to the real thing. because here was the shape of the secret she was carrying. Thomas Maddox had not been a good man. He had been a charming man, which was a different thing and a more dangerous one, and Belle had not understood the difference until she was already married and the charm had done its work, and there was nothing left underneath it but cruelty with a silver tongue. Thomas had been involved in a scheme to defraud homesteaders in Kansas, taking their money for land titles that he had no authority to issue, selling the same parcels twice, 3 times, ruining families and vanishing the money into an account that no one could trace. Belle had found out about it in the 2nd year of their marriage. She had found the ledger. She had not gone to the law immediately. That was the truth that shamed her. She had been afraid. She had argued with Thomas, who had threatened her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and told her that if she went to anyone, he would ensure she was implicated alongside him. He had put her name on 2 of the documents. Without her knowledge, without her consent, but her signature on paper looked very much like her signature on paper regardless of how it got there. She had spent 8 months trying to find a way out that did not destroy her. Then Thomas had made the mistake that many men who believe themselves to be the most dangerous person in any room eventually make. He had underestimated someone else. A homesteader named Cord Pauley, who had lost everything to Thomas's scheme and who had found Thomas in a Dodge City saloon in the spring of 1880 and shot him twice in the chest, which was a terrible thing, and also, in the particular moral arithmetic of the frontier, not an entirely unjust one. Thomas Maddox was dead, Cord Pauley was in a Kansas prison, and Belle Maddox was free, but free in the way that a bird whose cage door has been left open is free, standing there at the threshold, uncertain whether the world outside it was safer than the one she'd known. She had gone to a lawyer. She had shown him the ledger which she had kept. She had told him everything. The lawyer had spent 2 months untangling her name from the documents and establishing that her signature had been forged and that she had had no knowledge of or material benefit from the scheme. It had cost her nearly everything she had. But she had come out of it with a clean name and no legal liability and the specific, hollow dignity of having done the right thing 18 months too late. She had left Kansas. She had gone to Santa Fe, then to Tulliver. She had taken her dead husband's last name because it was on her teaching certificate, and changing it required paperwork she could not afford, and because no one in Tulliver would know Thomas Maddox's name, and so it could not hurt her there. She had told no one. She had told no one because the story was shameful even when you told it truthfully, even when your innocence was established by a lawyer's letter and a clean record. The story was shameful because she had stayed too long and known too late, and that was a stain that no document could fully remove, not in the moral economy of 1882. This was the secret she would have to tell Gilbert Graves if she was going to sit at his kitchen table and let his youngest daughter ask her to stay. She was not yet ready to tell it. She spent 3 days after the lantern evening in a state of private war with herself. She taught school. She ate her meals alone above the dry goods store. She read the books she kept stacked beside her single bed and found she could not concentrate on any of them. She woke on the 4th morning and decided the solution was simple and the solution was distance, and she spent that day being very deliberately busy, and that evening she took a walk that did not go anywhere near the Graves farm. On the 5th day, Rosie appeared at the schoolhouse door at 3 in the afternoon, having walked 3 miles by herself, which Belle discovered with a jolt of alarm. "Does your father know you're here?" Belle asked. "I told Ida where I was going," Rosie said, which was not quite the same thing. "Rosie, she's 11. She can be responsible." Rosie came fully inside and looked around the schoolhouse with the assessing look she gave everything. "Papa's been different this week." "Different how?" "Quieter." Rosie sat down at the nearest desk. "He's already quiet, but this week he's been the kind of quiet where he's thinking about something he won't say." She paused. "He does that when something matters to him. He's always been like that. Mama used to say he held his important things inside like they were eggs, like he was afraid to drop them." Belle sat down at her desk and looked at this extraordinary child. "Rosie," she said carefully, "why did you ask me to stay the other night? Not as a polite thing, I mean truly. Why did you ask?" Rosie considered her with those dark, patient eyes. "Because Papa looked at you," she said. "He never looks at anyone like that. He looks at the land and at the cattle and at us. He looks at things that matter to him. He looked at you like you mattered." The silence that followed was very full. "We are neighbors," Belle said. "That is all we are." "You don't believe that," Rosie said. And then, with devastating simplicity, "Do you want to be something else?" Belle stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the empty street of Tulliver, at the dust and the late afternoon light and the far mountains going purple at their edges. And she thought about Thomas Maddox and Cord Pauley and a Kansas lawyer's office, and the specific quality of Gilbert Graves's attention. "It is complicated," she said. "Some things in my past are complicated." "Papa has complicated things in his past too," Rosie said. "He never talks about his father. Ida says his father was not a good man. He doesn't talk about the first years in Texas either. He only ever talks about now and about us." She paused. "He says the past is the country you come from, not the country you live in." Belle turned around. "He said that?" she asked. "Last winter," Rosie said, when Ida asked why he never talked about his own papa. Belle sat back down and looked at the lantern that sat on her desk, because she had bought herself a new one and she kept it there. She thought about borrowed light and the places it led you. "Will you walk back with me?" she asked. 3 miles is a long way alone for someone your age, and I would feel better seeing you home." Rosie smiled, and it was the full, uncomplicated smile of a child who has gotten exactly what she came for, which was more than just the escort home. They walked the 3 miles together in the long October light, and Belle told Rosie about the book she was teaching, and Rosie told Belle about the horse her father had let her name, which she had named Copernicus, because Ida had told her that was the man who said the earth went around the sun, and Rosie had thought that was the best idea she'd ever heard. "That's an excellent name for a horse," Belle said. "Papa thought it was peculiar," Rosie said cheerfully. "He said it, though. He says all the names we choose, even if he thinks they're peculiar. He says a name is a person's right." Belle looked at the road ahead and felt something in her chest doing something uncomfortable and unstoppable. They arrived at the farm as the sun was going down, and Gilbert was in the yard, and when he saw them coming up the road together, he stood very still for a moment, and then he walked to meet them, and his expression when it reached Belle was difficult to read, layered with things she did not have enough information to fully interpret. "I'm in trouble," Rosie announced, before he could say anything. "You walked to town alone," he said. His voice was level but not entirely. "I walked back with Miss Maddox," Rosie said, "which is safer than alone, so really I only did half a bad thing." Gilbert looked at Belle. Belle looked at Gilbert. "Thank you," he said, "for walking her back." "She came to find me," Belle said. "She was worried about you." Something moved across his face at that, brief and unguarded. "You should come in," he said. "It's getting cold." "I should get back," Belle said. "You walked 3 miles," he said. "The least I can offer is coffee and time off your feet before you turn around." She stayed for coffee. She stayed for coffee that turned into supper that she helped Ida cook, while Gilbert fixed the hinge on the back door that had been sticking. And the whole while the evening felt exactly like the other evening, like something that had been specifically calibrated to undermine every wall she had carefully constructed over the past year and a half. After supper, after Rosie was in bed and Ida had taken herself up to read, Belle stood at the kitchen table and Gilbert stood by the stove, and there was a silence between them that had weight. "Rosie thinks," Belle said carefully, "that you have been quiet this week." "I have been," he said. "She worries about you." "I know," he paused. "I worry about her sometimes, too. She thinks too hard about the people around her. She always has. Even when Martha was alive, she would study people." "She is very perceptive," Belle said. "She told me something last night," Gilbert said. He was looking at the top of the stove at the banked coals. "She told me she had asked you to stay the other evening because she thought I looked at you in a particular way." Belle went very still. "She is 7, she managed. "She is the most observant person I know," he said. He turned then and looked at her, and his gaze was direct in the way it always was, not aggressive, not presumptuous, simply completely present. "I am not going to pretend she was wrong," he said. "That would be dishonest, and I am not willing to be dishonest with you." "Mr. Graves," she said. "Gilbert," he said, "if you would, please." She let out a breath. "Gilbert, I am not asking anything of you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I understand that you have a life that is private and circumstances I know nothing about. I am not asking you to share those things. I am only saying that Rosie was not wrong, and I did not want to let you leave without saying that plainly, because you deserve to have true things said plainly, instead of circled around." Belle looked at him and felt the secret inside her pressing against her ribs like something alive. "There are things about me," she said slowly, "that are not simple, things from before I came here. I have not told anyone in this county, and I am not certain I am ready to tell even you, but I want you to know that they exist, because I would not want you to say true things plainly and then have me say nothing in return, as though your honesty was worth less than my silence." He regarded her carefully. "You are not in any danger?" he asked. "Nothing that is going to come to this county and put you in harm's way?" "No," she said. "It is settled, legally settled. It is only a matter of the story being an unpleasant one to tell." "Then tell it when you're ready," he said. "Or never tell it. You do not owe me your past, Belle." And then he stopped, as if using her first name without permission had surprised him from inside. "Miss Maddox," he corrected. "Belle," she said. "If you would, please." And that was the beginning of it. That was the actual, true beginning. Not the borrowed lantern and not the evening on the porch, but this kitchen with the coals in the stove and the plainly said true things and the first name given back. She walked home in the dark with her new lantern, and the flame in its glass chamber was her own. The weeks that followed were a careful, unhurried courtship conducted mostly in the open air and at kitchen tables and at the schoolhouse door, in the presence of Rosie and Ida, and occasionally the watchful eyes of Tulliver, which had opinions about everything and shared them freely. Mrs. Eliza Carver, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the social arbiter of the county, made a pointed remark to Belle one morning in November about the frequency of her presence at the Graves farm, and Belle had looked at her pleasantly and said, "I am very fond of his daughters," which was true, and also, crucially, not the whole truth. Gilbert came to the school board meeting in November when Calloway made his annual attempt to reduce the school budget, and sat in the back row. And when Calloway said that the second teacher's position was an unnecessary expense, Gilbert raised his hand and said, in his unhurried way, that the county's children were not an unnecessary expense, and that a school with one teacher for 28 children of all ages was a school that was failing, and that he for one was not willing to accept a failing school in his county. He said it with the particular quiet forcefulness of a man who had made up his mind some time ago, and was simply informing the rest of the room. The vote went 4-1 in favor of keeping the position. Afterward, in the street outside, Belle said, "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. "You meant it, though." "I always mean what I say," he said, "including the things I don't say aloud." She looked at him in the November dark, in the cold air that smelled of wood smoke and the beginning of winter. "There is a social at the Grange Hall next Saturday," she said. "I have been told I am expected to attend." "I have been told the same," he said. "I would not be opposed to attending it in company," she said. "Neither would I," he said. They looked at each other in the dark of Tulliver's Main Street, two people being very careful with something fragile. And then Belle said good night and went up the stairs to her room above the dry goods store. And she stood at the window and looked out at the street for a long time, at the lamplight in the windows of the Grange and the saloon and the livery stable, at the ordinary, breathing life of a small county town, and she thought that this was the exact thing she had been afraid to want. The Grange social was on the second Saturday of November, and Belle wore the blue dress she had bought in Santa Fe, which was not extravagant but was better than anything she usually wore to public events. And she had been honest enough with herself by that point to admit that she had chosen it because of the color, which suited her, and she had wanted to suit herself. And the reason she had wanted to suit herself was specific and present, and standing at the Grange Hall door when she arrived. In a clean shirt and his good coat and his hat held in his hands, and he looked at her the way Rosie had described, the way reserved for things that matter. They danced twice, which was enough to be remarked upon and not enough to be scandalous, and between dances they stood together at the edge of the floor and talked about nothing important, about the winter coming and the cattle and what books Ida was reading, and none of it was important and all of it was, in the way that two people building trust use ordinary conversation as material the same way builders use stone. Mrs. Carver watched them with the expression of someone composing a letter. On the walk back from the social, which they had arranged without quite arranging it since they simply left at the same time and began walking in the same direction, he said, "I would like to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "Would you come to Sunday dinner, not as a courtesy call, as a guest, as my guest?" She stopped walking and looked at him. "That is a significant invitation," she said. "I meant it to be," he said. "Tulliver will talk," she said. "Tulliver talks regardless," he said. "I am not particularly interested in what Tulliver says about the choices I make regarding my family." "Including me," she said. "Do I qualify as a family choice?" He looked at her steadily. "I am asking Sunday dinner," he said. "That is what I am asking. The rest of the question can wait for the rest of our acquaintance." She said yes. Sunday dinner at the Graves farm was pot roast with carrots and potatoes because that was what Gilbert made when he was making a meal he wanted to go well, Ida told Belle privately, while they were setting the table. Ida told her this with the manner of a person providing crucial operational intelligence, very straight-faced, very matter-of-fact, which made Belle love her with a fierceness that she immediately recognized was about more than Ida herself. She was falling in love with all of it: the farmhouse, the daughters, the particular domestic competence of a man who had raised 2 children alone for 2 years without letting anything fall apart, the pot roast, the honest attention, the way he had said the past was the country you came from and not the country you lived in, she told him in December. She had been working up to it for weeks, and she had the story organized in her mind, the cleanest version, the one with all the facts and none of the self-pity, and she told him on a Sunday evening after the girls had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them, because she had decided that if this was going to go anywhere real, he needed to know everything, and she was not willing to let his kindness be built on incomplete information. She told him about Thomas. She told him about the scheme, the forged documents, her name on the papers. She told him about the 8 months she had spent afraid. She told him about Cord Polly, who had shot her husband in a Dodge City saloon, and she told him that she had wept for Thomas's death, and that the grief was genuine even if the man had not deserved it, because grief was not a moral judgment. It was just a wound, and she had been wounded. She told him about the lawyer and the untangling and the clean record and Santa Fe and Tulliver. She told him all of it without crying mostly, and she told it plainly, the way he had said true things should be said. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "You were afraid," he said, "not a question, not a judgment." "I was," she said. "I stayed too long because I was afraid of what he would do if I left. I know that is not admirable." "It is human," he said. "Fear is human." "I have been ashamed of it," she said, "not of the facts which I could not control, but of the months I spent being afraid instead of acting." "You acted when you could," he said. "You took the ledger to a lawyer. You told the truth when it mattered." 18 months after it would have mattered most, she said. "Belle." He said her name with a quiet certainty that stopped the argument she was having with herself. "You survived a man who wanted you silenced. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is something to have survived." She looked at him across the lamp and the kitchen table, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 2 years, literally 2 years in the shape of that particular shame, opened. "Is this," she said carefully, "something you can accommodate, knowing that about my past? Is it a past you're still living in?" he asked. No, she said. Then yes, he said, I can accommodate it entirely. She thought about what Rosie had told her. The past is the country you come from, not the country you live in. Rosie told me you said that, she said, about the country you come from. Something changed in his expression, very faintly, the kind of change that meant she had reached a private place. I believe it, he said. Your father, she asked. She had not asked before. A pause, a long one, but he answered. My father was a hard man, he said. Not cruel in the calculating way you describe Thomas, hard in the way that believes harshness is strength. He thought kindness was a failure of nerve. He raised me on that principle, and I spent 20 years unlearning it. He paused again. Martha helped me unlearn it. The girls helped me unlearn it. I do not think I am the man my father wanted me to be. I think I am a considerably better one. I know you are, Belle said. They were quiet together for a moment, and the lamp burned, and outside the wind was coming down off the mountains the way it did in December, cold and absolute. Belle, he said, yes. I would like to court you formally, if you are willing. I would like it to be known in this county and in this house that I am courting you, and that my intentions are to ask you a much larger question at such time as we both feel ready for it. She looked at his hands on the table, those steady, careful hands. Rosie will be insufferable, she said. Rosie will be delighted, he said. Which is its own kind of insufferable, yes. Belle laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind she had not made in a very long time, the kind that had no caution in it. Yes, she said, I am willing. They told Rosie the following Sunday morning, and Rosie's response was to look between them with the deeply satisfied expression of someone whose theory has been proven correct and say, I knew it when you kept the lantern. She borrowed my lantern, Rosie, Gilbert said. That is not a metaphor. Everything is a metaphor, Rosie said, with the serene authority of someone who had read too many of her sister's books. Ida hugged Belle, briefly and firmly, in the way of someone who feels things deeply and expresses them in compressed form, and then stepped back and adjusted her expression to something more composed and said, I am very glad. And Belle thought she might not have ever received a compliment she valued more. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a courtship conducted in the ordinary, extraordinary texture of daily life in the New Mexico territory. Belle was at the farm often, not every day. She had her school and her independence, and she was not the kind of woman who dissolved herself into another life without keeping hold of her own, but often enough that the rhythm of the place began to be familiar to her in her body, the creak of the porch step, the way the morning light came through the kitchen window, the sound of Rosie talking to Copernicus in the paddock. Gilbert came to her schoolhouse on Fridays to walk her back to her room above the dry goods store, and sometimes they walked long ways around, through the edge of the county where the cottonwoods still held their late leaves, copper and gold against the winter sky, and they talked about everything and nothing, and the specific complexity of two people who had each been solitary for a long time learning how to share interior space. He was interested in everything she thought. That was one of the things about him that she had to keep re-encountering, because it kept surprising her. He asked her questions about books, about teaching, about what she thought the territory needed in terms of education and law, and the rights of the people who lived there, the Pueblo communities and the Spanish land-grant families, and the Anglo settlers all layered on top of each other in complicated historical debt. He listened when she answered, and he remembered what she said, and he cited it back weeks later in conversations about other things. He made her feel like her thoughts were worth tracking. She had not known, before Gilbert, what it was like to be in the company of a man who was interested in her intelligence rather than only her appearance, and the discovery of it was not innocent or neutral. It was the specific kind of damage that good things do to you when they arrive after you have learned to expect nothing. She told him that once, on one of their long walks in January, with the ground frozen and their breath in clouds between them, and he stopped walking and turned to look at her. I am sorry, he said, that you had to learn to expect nothing. It made me better at gratitude, she said. I am deeply grateful for everything now, every ordinary good thing. Like lanterns, he said. Like lanterns, she said. He reached out and took her gloved hand, which was the most purely physical thing he had done since the Grange social, and she felt it through the wool all the way to somewhere central. I would like there to be a great many ordinary good things, he said. For a long time, I would like that very much. She looked up at him in the January cold, in the high desert winter with the mountains white above them and the cottonwoods bare and the frozen road empty in both directions. So would I, she said. He asked her to marry him in March. He did it in the kitchen, which was where they had done everything that mattered, with the lamp on the table and the stove warm and both girls conspicuously upstairs, which they had clearly been told to be because there was no sound at all from above, which was highly unusual and therefore obvious. He did not get down on one knee, which surprised her, but then he explained why, which was that he had discussed it with Ida and Ida had told him that kneeling made the whole thing performative and Belle was not the kind of woman who responded well to performance. She was the kind of woman who responded to sincerity, and he should just say it plainly. I took your daughter's romantic advice, Belle said. She was right, he said, without any embarrassment at all, which was one of the things she loved about him, the total absence of vanity about where good ideas came from. Belle Maddox, I am asking you to marry me, to be my wife and to share this farm and this life and these daughters and everything that comes after. I am asking you because you are the most remarkable person I have met, and because my life has been measurably better since you came into it, and because I have been in love with you since approximately the second time we spoke, and I have not been in love with anyone since Martha and I had forgotten entirely what it felt like, and the experience of remembering has been both very good and slightly overwhelming. She stared at him. Slightly overwhelming, she repeated. Perhaps more than slightly, he allowed. She stood up and crossed the kitchen and took his face in her hands, and she said, Yes, Gilbert Graves, I will marry you. And then she kissed him for the first time, which she had been wanting to do since approximately the same moment he described, and it was exactly what she had known it would be, which was to say it was thorough and warm and completely unshowy, and it felt like something that was supposed to happen. Upstairs, they heard Rosie say clearly, That's the kissing part, Ida, and Ida say, in her pained 11-year-old voice, I know, Rosie. And then there was the sound of rapid small feet on the stairs and Rosie arrived in the kitchen at full speed and launched herself at both of them simultaneously with a force that was frankly impressive for a 7-year-old. And Ida followed at a more dignified pace, and Gilbert stood in his kitchen with his arms around his daughters and his eyes on Belle. And his expression was so open and unguarded that Belle had to look at the floor for a moment, because the full weight of the happiness in the room was more than she could take straight on. They were married in May of 1883 in the Tulliver Grange Hall, which was the largest indoor space in the county and which was full. The county had opinions about everything and attended everything, and the wedding of the Graves widower to the Santa Fe schoolteacher was sufficiently interesting that even people with conflicting social commitments rearranged their schedules. Mrs. Carver attended and later said the ceremony was quite dignified, which in Mrs. Carver's vocabulary was the highest available compliment. Sheriff Cade Hutton shook Gilbert's hand for what seemed like longer than necessary and said, You have done well for yourself, Graves, and looked at Belle with an expression that suggested he meant it as a genuine assessment rather than a pleasantry. Rosie was the flower girl and took the role with the gravity of a head of state. She had insisted on white flowers, which Ida had helped her find, and she walked down the aisle of the Grange Hall with absolute precision and a look of profound concentration. And when the ceremony was over, she went directly to Belle and said, I knew about the lantern. And Belle picked her up and held her and said, I know you did, sweetheart. They had a wedding dinner in the Grange Hall, and then they went home, the four of them, to the farm that was now Belle's farm too, with the porch and the boot scraper and the kitchen that smelled of cumin and wood smoke. And Rosie fell asleep in the wagon before they arrived, and Gilbert carried her inside and laid her in her bed without waking her. And Ida said good night to both of them with her compressed, heartfelt manner. And then it was just the two of them in the kitchen. Belle stood in the kitchen of the house she now lived in, of the life she now lived, and looked at the lamp on the table and thought of the borrowed lantern and Rosie's face in the doorway and the 2 or 3 hours of flame left in the glass chamber and everything that had come after. "Are you thinking about lanterns?" Gilbert asked. She looked up at him. "How did you know?" "You have a particular expression," he said. "I have been learning your expressions." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and put her hands on his chest and felt him breathe. "I am thinking about how much has changed," she said. "Since I was standing on your porch with that borrowed lantern and not knowing what was about to happen." "What has changed?" he said. "Everything," she said. "Everything I was afraid to want, I have. Everything I thought was too late or too complicated or too much for someone with my history. All of it." He put his arms around her and she leaned into the solid, steady warmth of him. And outside, the May night in the New Mexico territory was warm and the stars were enormous, and a horse in the paddock was almost certainly Copernicus, named for the man who moved the sun. "Not too late," he said. "Not too complicated. Not too much." He paused. "Also not over. We have a great deal of ordinary good things still to come." She laughed again, the unguarded laugh. "We do," she said. The summer of 1883 was extraordinary in the specific way that first summers in a new life are extraordinary, which is to say it was mostly made of ordinary things, cooking and farming and teaching, and the particular rhythm of a house with 2 children in it. But all of it was lit differently, the way everything looks different when you are inside your own life rather than standing adjacent to it. Belle kept the school. She had made it plain before the wedding that she intended to, and Gilbert had made it equally plain that he would not have it any other way, which prompted Mrs. Carver to say at the quilting circle that it was unusual for a wife to continue in employment after marriage, and prompted Belle to say, when this report reached her, that she was very much looking forward to being unusual. The school had 28 students from ages 6 to 14, and Belle taught them reading and arithmetic and geography, and once a week, what she called practical reasoning, which was a class that involved thinking through problems out loud and arguing with each other respectfully, which was a skill that Belle believed the territory needed more than almost any other. The children took to it with ferocity. She was an excellent teacher. She had always known she was an excellent teacher, even in the years when knowing good things about herself had felt like a suspect activity. Gilbert was proud of her in a way that was both quiet and complete. He came to the end-of-year demonstration in June and sat in the front row and watched his daughters and his wife's students argue about water rights and crop rotation, and whether the railroad was good for the territory. And afterward he said, "You are changing what these children think is possible." And she had held that sentence in her chest for weeks. In August, Belle's oldest friend, a woman named Clara Messon who had known her since Kansas, and who had been one of the people who had helped her through the worst of the Thomas years, came to visit from Santa Fe. Clara was a sturdy, direct woman of 30 who had opinions about everything and wasted no words, and she arrived on the stage with 2 bags and an assessment of Tulliver that she delivered within minutes of arrival. "Small," she said, "but honest-looking. I approve of honest-looking." Clara liked Gilbert immediately, which Belle had expected, and Gilbert received Clara's very direct scrutiny with his customary equanimity, which Clara told Belle later was the most impressive thing she had seen a man do in some time. "Most men fold under direct scrutiny," Clara said. "He just looked back like he had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. Where did you find him?" "He lent me a lantern," Belle said. "Of course he did," Clara said. Clara stayed 2 weeks and declared at the end of her visit that Belle Maddox Graves had, against all probability and after considerable suffering, arranged herself a genuinely good life, and that she had been worried for years that Belle would not allow herself that, and that she was relieved and happy and planned to visit again next spring. Ida, who had spent 2 weeks in thoughtful conversation with Clara about everything from suffrage to the nature of the common law, shook Clara's hand when she left and said, "You should come back. You are one of the most interesting people I have met in this county." And Clara had looked at Ida with delighted respect and said, "Girl, you are going to change everything." Autumn came around again, the first anniversary of the borrowed lantern, and Belle stood in the kitchen on an October evening and lit the lamp on the table and watched it catch, and she thought about the particular quality of borrowed light and what you do with it. You use it to find your way. You carry it until you can get a light of your own. And then, if you are very fortunate, you find a place where the light is already burning and the door opens before you can knock twice, and what is inside is so full and real and warm that you understand why you were carrying the borrowed one in the first place. It was leading you here. It was always leading you here. She heard the door and turned, and Gilbert came in from the evening, and he said, "You're standing in the kitchen looking at a lamp again." And she said, "A habit I have developed." And he hung his hat and came to stand beside her, and they looked at the lamp together for a moment. "I have something to tell you," she said. Something in her voice made him go very still. "Belle," he said, "we are going to have a baby," she said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone reorganizing everything inside themselves very rapidly, and then Gilbert turned to her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something beneath all the steadiness, something young and open and utterly undone. "A baby," he said. "In the spring," she said. "I went to see Dr. Fendall in Tulliver last week and he confirmed it. Late April, he thinks." Gilbert sat down at the kitchen table slowly in the way of someone who needs a surface under them. She sat across from him. "I know it is a great deal," she said carefully. "Ida and Rosie and now Belle." He reached across the table and took her hands. "I have wanted this. I want this more than I can reasonably explain." He paused. "I was afraid to want it after Martha. I thought it was greedy to want more than I already had. I thought," he stopped. "I thought I should be grateful for what I had and not reach further." "Reaching further is allowed," she said softly. "I know that now," he said. "They told the girls that evening." Rosie's response was instantaneous and categoric. She wanted a brother. She had thought about it previously without knowing she was thinking about it, and she was firmly of the opinion that a brother was what was required. Ida, with characteristic precision, said that the preference was biologically premature, but that regardless of the outcome she was looking forward to it, and could she please be the one to choose the name. "That is the second Graves child to lay claim to naming rights," Gilbert said. "You named the calf," Ida pointed out. "I named the calf because neither of you had a suggestion that didn't involve celestial bodies," he said. "Galileo was a perfectly good name for a calf," Rosie said. "It was an excellent name for a calf," Belle said. "It was also a name I refused to call a calf in public." The winter came and Belle grew large and the farm continued, and the school continued, and life had the quality of something very full, not hurried, not frantic, full in the deep satisfying way that a well-made thing is full, without surplus and without lack. She had one difficult night in December, one of those nights that came occasionally, even now, when the old shame surfaced in the dark and she lay awake going over the Thomas years, the months of fear, the things she had not done when she should have done them. She got up so as not to disturb Gilbert and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with her hands around a mug of warm water, and after a few minutes she heard his footstep on the stair and he came in, sleep-rumpled and unhurried, and sat across from her without asking, because he had learned by now when questions were needed and when presence was enough. She told him what she was thinking. He listened. When she was done, he said, "The women who come to this territory from difficult circumstances do not always have the luxury of perfect choices in the moment. What they have is the instinct to survive and the courage to do better when they are safe enough to do better. You did both. That is not a shameful history, Belle. That is a brave one." She looked at him in the dark kitchen and loved him so completely that it was almost a grief, the way extreme happiness sometimes was. "I do not know how you do that," she said. "Take the exact worst thing I am telling myself and find the true thing inside it." I have had practice, he said, with myself. She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat there together in the winter dark until the worst of it passed, and then he made her go back to bed because she was 7 months pregnant and the kitchen floor was cold. The baby came in late April of 1884, which Dr. Fendall said was close enough to his prediction to count as accuracy, and it was a boy, which satisfied Rosie completely and made Ida say, with the deliberate grace of someone who has not gotten their first choice but is genuinely content with their second, "A brother will be interesting." His name was Henry, and Ida named him, and Gilbert held him in the kitchen with the lamp burning on the table and looked at him with the same expression he had given everything he loved, the one that was quiet and total and didn't need to announce itself. Belle looked at Gilbert holding their son and felt the thing she had felt in fragments all year, the thing that was too large for any single moment, the full weight of a life that had arrived after she had stopped believing she was allowed to have one. Henry was small and noisy and had his father's eyes and his mother's forehead, and Rosie announced within 24 hours that she was his primary protector, and Ida said she was his primary educator, and Henry apparently had no opinion on the matter as he was 4 days old and occupied entirely with the business of existing. Tulliver received the news of Henry's arrival with the warmth of a community that had been watching this particular story develop for a year and a half and felt invested in its outcome. Sheriff Hutton came by the farm with a jar of preserves from his wife and looked at Henry in his cradle and said, "Good job, Graves," in the tone of someone assessing structural soundness. Mrs. Carver sent a card and a blanket she had made herself, which Belle kept for 30 years. Clara Messon arrived on the June stage as she had promised, took one look at Henry, declared him satisfactory, took one look at Belle and said, "You are happy," in the tone of someone confirming a fact they had hoped for a long time. Belle said yes, she was, and Clara said, "Good," and left it at that because Clara was not sentimental but she was fiercely and quietly glad. The summer of 1884 settled around the Graves farm like a good season should, with enough rain and not too much heat, and the crops coming in solid, and the particular domestic music of a house with an infant in it, which is loud and disorganized and extraordinary. Belle went back to the school in September, with Henry at 3 months old in the care of Ida in the mornings, which Ida approached with the gravity of a very young adult and the competence of someone who had been raised by Gilbert Graves. Rosie was in Belle's class by then, and Belle was required to be her teacher the way she was any other student's teacher, which meant Rosie could not be given special treatment, which meant Rosie competed ferociously with every other student to earn the recognition that was given to everyone else on merit. She was, Belle told Gilbert privately, the most motivating student she had ever taught, not because she was the best, though she was excellent, but because she treated every lesson as a personal challenge between herself and the material. "That's how she treats everything," Gilbert said. "Where do you think she gets it?" Belle said. He looked at her. "Probably both of us," he said. She leaned against his shoulder in the evening kitchen with Henry asleep in the next room, and Rosie's homework on the table in front of them and Ida upstairs with her books, and the lamp burning, and thought about lanterns, about borrowed light and returned light, and the light you made yourself in the places you were brave enough to stop. 3 years passed in the way that good years pass, quickly from the outside and fully from the inside, with the texture of lived life so present and continuous that you cannot see the seams between the months. The farm prospered, carefully and without drama, because Gilbert was the kind of farmer who did not take risks. He did not understand and did not overextend what he had, which meant they were not rich but they were solid, and solid in the territory was its own kind of wealth. Belle's school grew. By 1886, it had 35 students, and she had successfully lobbied the county for a second classroom and a part-time assistant, a young man named Foster who had just come from a teacher's college in Missouri, and who turned out to be both capable and open to instruction, which Belle found refreshing. She had developed by this point a reputation in the county and the territory as an educator of real ability, and she had been approached by the Territorial Education Board about a consulting position that would require her to visit schools in other parts of the territory twice a year, which she and Gilbert had discussed at length and agreed would be beneficial to both the territory and herself. He managed the farm and the children during her absences, which were never more than 2 weeks and usually shorter, and when she returned, she was always met by the same thing, which was Rosie on the porch and Ida in the doorway and Gilbert behind them with Henry on his hip, and the particular expression that she had decided some time ago was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. In the spring of 1887, Belle found out she was pregnant again. She told Gilbert in the kitchen, same as last time, and he received the information with the same temporary interior reorganization, and then the same open, undone happiness, and she said, "You are going to need to find me a bigger kitchen," and he said, "I will start on the addition this summer." And the following June the addition was done, and in the autumn of 1887 their second child together was born. It was a girl, and they named her Margaret, which had been Gilbert's grandmother's name, and which Belle thought was strong and exact and suited. Margaret arrived into a house that was already full of competent people who had strong opinions about her, and she absorbed this from birth and responded to it by developing, from her earliest months, the particular determination of a youngest child who refuses to be managed, which delighted Rosie, who recognized a kindred spirit, and gently challenged Ida, who met it with equanimity and good humor. Henry, who was 3 when Margaret arrived, regarded her with the focused seriousness of a child who has been promoted to a new position and intends to perform it well. He appointed himself her companion from the day she came home, and took the role with a gravity that was so precisely his father that Belle sometimes had to look away to compose herself. By 1888, the Graves farm housed 2 adults, 4 children ranging from 2 to 18, and a horse named Copernicus who had been with them since before Belle arrived, and who showed no signs of aging in any way that was inconvenient. Ida, at 18, was preparing to attend a teacher's college in Albuquerque, the first person from Harlan County to do so in some years. Belle had written her letters of recommendation with the full force of her considerable vocabulary and genuine pride, and the college had admitted Ida without hesitation. The morning Ida left, Belle stood in the yard with her and held both her hands and looked at this young woman who had once greeted her at a kitchen door with compressed, heartfelt warmth and said, "You are going to be extraordinary. You already are, and this world is going to know it." Ida, who was 18 and composed and did not cry as a general rule, pressed her lips together very firmly. "Thank you," she said, "for being here, for being our family." Belle held her for a moment. "Thank you for letting me in." Ida left on the Tulliver stage at 8 in the morning, and Gilbert watched the stage out of sight down the road, and Belle stood beside him and put her hand in his, and he squeezed it without looking at her, because sometimes you did not need to look to communicate exactly what you meant. "She will do well," Belle said. "She will do better than well," he said. "She is herself. That is sufficient for anything." Rosie, who had just turned 13 and was in the period of her life where she was loudly and confidently herself in every possible direction, put her arm around her father's waist from the other side and said, "I miss her already." And Gilbert put his arm around Rosie, and Henry leaned against Belle's side, and Margaret, who was 2 and not entirely clear on the significance of the occasion, sat on the fence post and announced that she wanted breakfast. Belle laughed and lifted Margaret off the fence post and carried her inside, and behind her she heard Rosie say to Gilbert, "Miss Maddox was the best thing that ever came up that road," and she heard Gilbert say, quietly, "Agreed." She stood in the kitchen with Margaret on her hip, and the morning coming through the window, and the stove warm, and the lamp she kept on the table even in the daytime, a habit she had developed and intended to keep, and she thought about a woman standing on a porch with a borrowed lantern and a decision she almost didn't make. She thought about Rosie's face in the doorway, those dark, patient eyes, those 7-year-old eyes that had seen something she hadn't seen herself yet. Would you stay? Just until this lantern burns all the way down, she had stayed. She had stayed and the lantern had burned down and the morning had come and the morning after that. And the ordinary, extraordinary life had arrived one day at a time, one meal at a time, one conversation at a time, in the kitchen that smelled of cumin and wood smoke, and now also Margaret's hair and Henry's grass-stained knees, and the books Rosie left on every flat surface, and the particular scent of good work done by good people over time. The lantern on her kitchen table burned every day. She kept it full. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the farm was quiet, she and Gilbert sat together in the kitchen the way they had sat on the first evening, and talked, or did not talk, and the lamp burned between them, and the territory night came down around the farmhouse, and Belle Maddox Graves, who had once been afraid that the life she wanted was something she had forfeited, was completely, quietly, irrevocably home. Rosie turned 14 in the winter of 1888 and declared at her birthday dinner that she intended to be a scientist, specifically the kind who studied the behavior of weather patterns, because she had been watching the sky over the New Mexico territory for 14 years and had developed theories that she was prepared to defend. Gilbert listened to this announcement with his full attention and said, "Tell me the theories." And Rosie told him the theories for approximately 45 minutes with diagrams she had prepared in advance. Belle watched her husband listen to his daughter talk about weather patterns with the same quality of attention he gave to everything he valued, and thought that there were many ways to be a good man, and that the particular way Gilbert Graves was a good man was one she intended to spend the rest of her life being grateful for. Henry, at 4, fell asleep in his chair during Rosie's weather presentation and was carried to bed by his father, and Belle sat with Margaret in her lap and thought about the school year ahead and the letter she had received from the Territorial Education Board and the spring that was coming, slow and inexorable, the way springs came in the high desert, the way everything good came, gradually and then all at once. The territories were changing. The railroad had been through for years now, and had brought with it more people and more complexity, and more of the country's particular American argument about who belonged and who had rights, and who was owed what. Belle taught all of it, the history and the argument and the ongoing injustice of how this land had been taken from the Pueblo and Navajo and Apache peoples who had been here long before any of the arriving settlers. And she taught it because she believed that honest accounting was the only foundation on which anything lasting could be built. She caught pushback from county parents occasionally and handled it the same way she had handled Callaway at the school board meetings, by saying true things plainly until the untrue ones ran out. Gilbert backed her publicly every single time. He said once, at a county meeting where a parent had raised objections to the curriculum, "My wife teaches children to think. If your objection is to children thinking, you are going to find this county very uncomfortable in the years ahead, because they will all grow up and some of them are going to have extraordinary thoughts." It had been, by any measure, the best thing said at any county meeting in recent memory. Belle had been sitting in the third row and had looked at her hands to avoid smiling in a way that would undermine her professional dignity, and had loved him so hard in that moment that she thought her heart might simply not survive it. By the spring of 1889, with the territory beginning its long push toward statehood and the school expanding again, and Margaret starting to follow Henry everywhere with determined small legs, and Rosie corresponding with a weather scientist in Denver who had found her letters in a journal and written back with genuine respect, and Ida in Albuquerque writing letters that grew more confident and ambitious every month, and Gilbert building a second barn because the cattle operation had grown to justify it. Belle stood at the window of her kitchen on an April morning and understood something she had known for a long time in pieces but now knew completely. This was the life she had been leading toward, not despite the hard years, through them. The fear and the shame and the lawyer's office and the long, solitary repair of herself in Tulliver, the room above the dry goods store, the borrowed lantern, the 7-year-old in the doorway with her father's eyes. It had all been the road to here. Every broken thing had been broken precisely, the way a path breaks through terrain not arbitrarily, but because the going requires it. She heard boots on the porch steps. The deliberate scrape of the boot scraper. The door. Gilbert came in with the morning cold at his back and looked at her at the window and said, "You have the lamp expression." "I do," she said. He came to stand beside her and looked out at the April morning, the high desert waking up in the way it did, slowly and then with sudden total conviction, the sky going from dark blue to pale gold to the enormous blazing azure that was one of the permanent features of a life in this place. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "A woman on a porch," she said, "with a borrowed lantern, about to knock on a door." He looked at her. "I am glad she knocked," he said. "So am I," she said. They stood together at the window and the morning came in, and behind them the lamp on the kitchen table burned the way it always burned, steady and full and entirely their own. Later that morning, when Henry had gone out with his father to check on the new cattle, and Margaret had followed Rosie into the garden to watch her take measurements of the sky with the instruments she had ordered from the catalogue, Belle sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to Clara in Santa Fe. She wrote about the baby she was now fairly certain was coming in November, their third, which she and Gilbert had discussed and welcomed with the easy happiness of people who have room for what arrives. She wrote about Ida's latest letter, which had included a description of a classroom discussion she had led that sounded, Belle wrote, like something I might have started, which means I have successfully transferred the most important parts of my teaching. She wrote about the second barn, and the new cattle and Rosie's, whether correspondence and Henry's gravity and Margaret's absolute refusal to be managed. She wrote about Gilbert, not at length, because some things did not need length to be complete, but she wrote that she had understood something that morning about how a life comes together, not in a single moment but in the accumulation of moments, each ordinary one and each significant one laid next to each other until the whole becomes visible. She wrote that she was happy. She wrote it plainly, the way he had taught her to say true things. Then she folded the letter and sealed it and set it on the corner of the table where the outgoing mail went, and she refilled the lamp, and she put the kettle on, and she waited for the sound of boots on the porch steps and the scrape of the boot scraper and the door opening, which was the sound of her life, the ordinary daily sound of everything she had almost not allowed herself to have. It came, as it always did. It always would. The lantern burned on the kitchen table, full and steady, in the house on the Graves farm in Harlan County, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1889, and the woman who kept it burning had come here once with a borrowed flame and found, in the staying, a light she would carry for the rest of her long and luminous life.